hand things over to Greta, who is going to moderate and introduce her panelists. So have fun, guys.
All right. Well, here we are looking at Colonial, Pennsylvania. And we sort of chose this because it's more or less a microcosm of colonial America. And it was never guaranteed that Pennsylvania, or the land that was handed over to William Penn as a royal debt repayment, was definitely going to become America. There are a huge pile of possible other fates. And so we're going to work through 4 of these possible contingencies. And so I'm going to hand it off to Eric because he's with the people who are here first. Darn it.
That's right. Yeah, so we're actually going to be starting off with really specifically the Iroquois Confederacy. And the reason we have to talk about them first is they were really kind of the established power, if you want to call it that, in the Northeast as the Europeans started coming in. And they basically the Europeans had to deal with them the most. Now, for those with like a romantic view of the Iroquois Confederacy, you might tell you that the United States government under the Constitution is based kind of loosely on the Iroquois Confederacy. And to me, we need to go back just one version of the government first under the Articles of Confederation. The Iroquois Confederacy is essentially a very loose band of tribes that will combine the resources together when needed, but really they kind of all do their own thing. And then they will send a sachem, well, a representative to other tribes called a sachem, who will just kind of keep their eye on tribes for them. One of those tribes, or one of the areas that they would do it, is in Pennsylvania. And for our purposes over the next couple of minutes, we're going to focus on the Lenape and the Delaware, who are 2 very small tribes of hunter-gatherers who the Iroquois have claimed to conquer. Now, for those of us in audio, you do not see the air quotes that I am giving right now because there's really not much evidence that the Iroquois conquered anyone in Pennsylvania. There's not much evidence there was much trouble fighting, let alone a war that would be needed to help conquer a people. So the Iroquois, being big enough as they were, just kind of took over, or at least had the influence, whether it was true or not. Someone else looking to conquer in a slightly different way was the before mentioned William Penn, who gains control over Pennsylvania and the territory around the 1860s. And he has a mission that's kind of making Pennsylvania a form of utopia. But in this version, he actually wants to include Native Americans, which is not on everyone's agenda, especially going early on. So Penn, to his credit, will strike land deals with Native peoples that would be considered very generous by the standards of the time. But there's kind of one clear misunderstanding between the 2 parties. The English version of the deal would be once you make your deal and you have it's set, it's final. That's it. We move on with our lives. To where indigenous peoples, the Iroquois and the Delaware, the Lenape, they believe, well, this is more subscription based. So thank you for your gifts. It's very generous, but we're going to be coming back a little bit later for some more. Now, there are some hurt feelings going on over this conflict, but no major issues happen in Pennsylvania until basically William Penn's death happens around early 1817. When the land is handed down to Penn's sons, they do not exactly feel the same. In fact, they might have some creditors that are knocking on their doors looking to collect some money. Desperate, they try to find and to sell as much land as possible in order to pay off these debts. Even if the land maybe wasn't theirs to sell, who's to say? Because just magically overnight, they find a deed that said, I'm official, please allow me the lands to the Lenape and the Delaware. The Lenape and the Delaware kind of look at him like, no, yes, we had an agreement with your father, but however, we walked that together. This is bunk. This doesn't matter. But the sons are persistent enough where the Lenape just were basically, okay, we'll talk about it. We'll revisit it. Now, I literally mean walk because how the deals were determined in early Pennsylvania land agreements was basically the length of 2 parties could walk in a given time period, ride or walk across. Members of each party would start on a route at a leisurely pace. And they would even stop for lunch, which sounds kind of lovely. But however, because these creditors knocking on the door of the Penn brothers, well, there's There's no time for lunch, and they need to hurry it as fast as they can. So what do the brothers do? What is their contingency plan? Well, they are going to find 3 experienced hunters who know the area well and give them instructions to essentially say, whoever goes the farthest, we'll give you 500 acres at the end of this. So let's figure out the fastest route possible. And they do this. They come up with their route, and it all kind of comes together in September 1737 when the 2 parties of the Lenape and these 3 experienced hunters come together, and it's pretty clear early on that this is not the leisurely pace. In fact, these guys are kind of going on a planned route that was not expected. Now, they keep up a charade because they don't want to be like completely screwing over the Lenape, but they more or less power walk their way into it about 250 years before your neighborhood Karen believes that's a good idea. Now, natives cry foul almost immediately, but it's to little or no effect. They have to go on for the next day and a half, and by the second day, basically the Lenape walk away from this because it's ridiculous. However, the walkers continue on and now start jogging and or sprinting up until the very end of the time period. 65 miles later, the winner gets this 500 acres of land. Now, to tie this back into the Iroquois, maybe the Penn brothers had a bit of a chat with the sachem, and when the Lenape went to talk to the Iroquois were less than supportive and basically said, well, you had no business selling the land anyway, and that Lenape were made, quote, women by the Iroquois, and you had no ability to sell the land. So deal with it. There's nothing we're going to do. With both alternatives, with both of those options now out of the Lenape's hands, they now have to relinquish about 1,200 square miles of their land.
Aha. So, Sarah, since the Iroquois were in there and the Lenape and so on dealing with the British, what were sort of the British plans for this land?
Well, on the obviously grand, like British level, the British government level, there are other things going on. But when we're talking about the ground level of people actually in Pennsylvania, from the British side of things, there were 2 major factions, or you could argue that there were 3. First, there were the Quakers, which William Penn was famously a Quaker, but Quakers weren't exactly appreciated in their home country. By the time of the founding of Pennsylvania in 1681, and certainly by the time of the Revolution, they were basically the group that we know today, who were egalitarian and pacifistic and very much on the progressive side politically. But their origins were far more sort of radical and revolutionary. They were the most radical of the reformed sects during the English Civil War, and they made a point of being as disruptive and annoying to everyone else as they possibly could for about 10 years, until people who had similar ideas took it about 3 steps too far and instigated really seriously violent rebellions. And then the Quakers sort of differentiated themselves by saying, no, we're actually, we're cool. We kicked out all the crazies and we're just pacifists and nice people now. But the reputation continued to linger. They were still pretty anti-authoritarian. They were still sort of not the types of people that were predictable. And so they were still persecuted. And William Penn was kind of interesting in that he was a decidedly more religious man than his father. He had what he perceived to be a religious vision at 12 years old, and he actually took a sort of a left turn from his family history, and clearly one that his sons didn't necessarily abide by, and he was pretty genuine in his faith. And so when he was offered a colonial proprietorship in North America in exchange for relief of the king's debt, he took it, and he brought with him Quakers who were seeking a new life in the most positive possible sort of sense of the term. And these were predominantly English, but they were also Welsh and they were Irish. And it's worth noting that the religious toleration that Pennsylvania observed attracted people from other denominations as well, including Catholics who had basically nowhere else to go at this point. Now, a few years after William Penn did his thing, the promise of land and religious toleration attracted a second group of immigrants to Pennsylvania, and these were the Scots-Irish. They were the descendants of lowland Scots, some of whom came directly from Scotland, but most of them came from Northern Ireland, where they had been living for generations at this point. And they were in a pickle of their own. They had originally moved from Scotland to Ireland in order to avoid increasing rents, but life in Ireland had proved very, very difficult. They faced justifiable resentment from the local Irish people, both because of their religious differences and because of their national differences. And realistically speaking, these people on the ground weren't the ones who had caused the changes that put them in Ireland. They had just taken the options available to them to avoid poverty and rent increases. But that option involved going to a place where they weren't necessarily particularly welcome. And that strife had continued for generations, and it was only getting started. So now the Scots-Irish were facing increased rents again, and Pennsylvania looked like a really good option. So they moved there, they got a good deal on any of the land they got, and they became sort of the rough and tumbled counterpart to the Quakers' sort of urbane progressiveness. The third group here, though, did not come directly from England. It was the colony of Maryland. When Charles II granted Penn his charter, he wasn't exactly careful with the boundaries. He granted land which ended at a place that didn't exist, and it gave some of the Chesapeake to Pennsylvania, while it simultaneously gave the land in which Philadelphia is located to Maryland. And this resulted in a decades-long legal battle, which was only finally resolved with the creation of the Mason-Dixon line in 1768. The implication of this battle, though, were multifold. On the one hand, it determined who was the right recipients of the rents and taxes collected in the disputed areas, whether Penn or Lord Baltimore. And second, it impacted what those rents and taxes would be, which was higher in Maryland than Pennsylvania. And third, it determined what sort of government the colonists would live under. Pennsylvania was the most tolerant colony in America at the time. And while Maryland actually had started out as being the most tolerant colony, that had been sort of violently ended, and it was now the least so.
Okay, so that was one way things definitely could have gone. So along with our French, or along with our British immigrants, we had some French wandering around the area. So what were they up to, Jerry?
Absolutely. And that's one thing you don't necessarily, the French aren't the first people that you necessarily think of whenever you think of colonial Pennsylvania, but they were there at least for a short amount of time. But we've got to back up in the story for just a minute to kind of understand how the French, because French colonization in the Americas started in the mid 16th century and was really primarily focused a bit further north. It was focused on the St. Lawrence River region and what we now know of as Atlantic Canada, although their exploration and settlement spanned a wide geography. So what we now know of as Quebec was founded in 1608. And by the end of the century, there was a series of French forts from the Gulf of Mexico through the continent via the Mississippi River Basin to the Great Lakes and the St. Lawrence River Valley. And so if you look at maps, historic maps of this time period, you'll see this huge swath of land, typically in like a royal blue, like I'm wearing, because the French flag was blue and gold at the time. But it really is deceptive. Even though it was this wide geography, on the ground level, it was really still largely inhabited by the native peoples who had already been there. The French colonists were really few and far between. It was really these series of sparse settlements across this wide geography. And even if we look at if we look at the population statistics of the time, when we get to what we now know of as the French and Indian War, which is really the North American arena of the larger conflict called this war, British colonists in North America outnumbered the French by a ratio of 20 to 1. And this was a problem. It was also kind of a strength. So French explorers and leaders in North America had warned for decades this population disparity would work to the disadvantage of French interest in the area, because if we have so many British folks in the area, ultimately they're going to expand, they're going to take over some of these lands to the west. But despite concerted colonization efforts, the situation remained much the same of the colonial period. I did say that this was a potential strength, though, because really the lack of focus on colonization meant that the French generally enjoyed better relations with native nations. And that ultimately gets to what the French interest in the area was, which was trade. And in particular, the fur trade. That was their primary business. And it proved to be a quite lucrative commercial enterprise. There were some ups and downs, and in particular, the 7 Years' War was one of many conflicts over the time period, European conflicts. And when those conflicts happened and France was at war with other European, sometimes the French trade would go down, they would suffer downturns. But at this point, we're starting to get to the 1750s. The trade is picking up again, and indeed, the French government is leaning into it. But there's a danger of overreach when you're talking about something that's dealing with natural resources, and that started to lead to dwindling supply. So by the mid-18th century, it was proving impossible to keep up with demand without expanding their territory, and the French fur trade was increasingly coming under threat from British competitors. Those folks that Sarah was talking about were starting to move west. They were starting to move into these lands in the Ohio River Valley, and they were starting to get involved in this fur trade that the French had enjoyed. And so the French had to start thinking about what to do. Now, Eric J. Dolan, in his book on the history of the fur trade in North America, which is actually in Eric's background, Fur, Fortune, and Empire, he noted in there that, quote, the French and the English had been on a collision course in America since 1611, when an English vessel trading for furs near the Kennebec River captured a French trading vessel, claiming that the latter was trespassing on English territory. This tension would come into open conflict in what is now Western Pennsylvania as the French expanded into that area in the 1750s. The first French fort established was Fort Le Boeuf, which was built in modern-day Waterford, just inland from Lake Erie. And so that same year, Fort Presque Isle was established. Then the next year, Forts Machaut, as well as the most famous, arguably, French fort in Pennsylvania, Fort Duquesne, that's now modern-day Pittsburgh, was established. The constructions of these forts set up a critical flashpoint as the British colonial governments along the eastern seaboard, but in particular that of Virginia, became concerned about the exertion of French influence in the Ohio Valley. This was a key point. This was where you really have so much travel, so much trade, so much transportation through a large geographic area. This was a key point, and the British wanted that. The Ohio Company of Virginia had just been formed by prominent Virginians to promote trade and land speculation in the area, and the French expansion into this region threatened those aims. But the conflict would not just involve those of European descent, however, because native nations allied with Britain and France would find themselves in conflict with one another as well. Now, the open conflict between the European powers would occur when the governor of Virginia in 1753 sent this 21-year-old to the frontier to demand that the French remove themselves from the Ohio River Valley. That's right, I found a way to sneak in some presidential history because this 21-year-old was George Washington. And you can learn more about this by listening to the Presidencies of the United States podcast, because this is how it all starts. But this would not be Washington's finest moment. In his first mission, he did make it as far as Fort LaBeouf and delivered this message to the French forces to leave the area, to which they promptly replied, no. Then on the second mission to the area, without going into too many details for the sake of time, a French ensign, getting tongue-tied here. A French ensign, the Sieur de Jumonville, carrying a diplomatic message to order Washington and his forces out of the area. They're like, well, if you're going to order us out, we'll do the same to you. This emissary would end up being killed by the British and their native allies after being taken prisoner. Ultimately, the British would take Fort Duquesne in 1758, and the 7 Years' War would culminate in a peace treaty in which the French would relinquish nearly all of their North American colonies, including any claim that they had on the Ohio Valley and what we now know of as Western Pennsylvania. And though the French would remain a cultural influence and would play a key role in supporting the Patriot cause during the Revolutionary War, after the 7 Years' War, the threat of the French government rule in Pennsylvania, or really any part of the Ohio Valley, was at an end.
Okay, so since I'm at the end, I get to do summaries and stuff. But before I get to that, I am going to talk about the late arrival, the Germans. And okay, for my purposes, I am lumping together all of like the zillions of principalities and palatinates and dukedoms and whatever that were in the lands that we now call Germany, because I don't have time to list them all. But unlike the Iroquois and the British and even the French, who were sort of looking at America as, well, the Iroquois were just like, this is our home, or everybody who's already living there, this is ours. But the British and the French were really looking at America as a trading post, a place to extract a lot of money out of and to really continue to interact with the old country. The Germans, a little bit different. Because there were a zillion principalities and palatinates and dukedoms and what all, they were fighting with each other a whole bunch. And a lot of it was religious. You had sort of the small c Catholic religion, and then you had all of the different, what I affectionately call the Protestant weirdos. And they weren't getting along very well. And there were just a million little wars between everybody everywhere. And so a bunch of these smallholders, whether they were noble or not, are like, I am sick of war happening all over my land, or some of them were actually burned out of or kicked off their land. And a lot of them were getting recruited into fighting these wars. And many of them said, enough. So again, this is oversimplifying, but a lot of the small c Catholics went to the French lands, sort of the Louisiana, kind of upstream of the port of New Orleans, because as Catholics, they felt more welcome there. And the Protestants tended to go to Pennsylvania because it was tolerant of their Protestant weirdoism. And again, there is mixing and matching in both, but that was sort of the large tendencies. And so you had these German immigrants coming in, and unlike colonists who were basically sending out their strong man adventurers to go do strong man adventurer hunting stuff, they were coming as entire families to set up farms, to set up villages. And they were done with the old country. It was a mess. They didn't want to talk to anyone. They didn't want to trade with them. They wanted to be self-sufficient. And they wanted to sort of set up their own villages that were dealing with the locals and dealing with the land in a sustainable, long-term relationship. Unlike especially the French and the English, who were like, let's get our sassafras leaves, let's get our firs, let's get our big pine trees and send it all back to England and get some money, and then I can go home and be rich and impress people. The Germans were planning on staying for the long haul. And so they had a very different vision for possible German states in the New World than everybody else. So let's see. So since this was such a very different mission, they were always at cross purposes when they were talking political visions with especially the British, who were holding a lot of the governmental reins of power. So that's kind of where we are. Let's go to questions.
All right, so let's do it. We're in our last 15 minutes or so. So first off, we have a question from Robert, who asks, has there been a time when land and real estate developers not caused problems in America?
Short answer, no.
Yeah, I think it's a question of bigger problems or smaller problems.
For sure.
I mean, not for nothing. When the New World was discovered, there was so, like, it sounds ridiculous. There was so much land when you have landlocked Europe and everything else is claimed that it seemed like it was limitless. And then never mind the tribes that were already here would like to have a claim in that too. But yes, anytime there was a van that was unused, somebody wanted to claim it and buy it.
Absolutely. So I have a question as well. Is this reflective of how the other colonial settlements played out? Like, are the other states as contentious as Pennsylvania, or is this sort of a specifically unique feature?
I would argue, at least in terms of the ones that came before, it was pretty in keeping with it. I think it's just an iteration of it that maybe resonates a little bit more in the modern day, because like the themes were there in like colonial New England, and for all of the commendation that we give colonial New England for certain aspects of this vision, they also had certain aspects which were really, really not necessarily things that are sympathetic today. For instance, the execution of Quakers. And so it just, I feel like it was a progression of what was going on, but maybe like just finally they reached this area where it's like, okay, there's actually some stuff here that people can resonate with in the modern world.
Yeah, I think Penn, because he was trying to raise money, like he got this debt repayment back, but it really wasn't that useful. And so he was actually going out and advertising for a lot more people to come to Pennsylvania. So I think it was a bigger mixing bowl than some places. But if you look at sort of Georgia, which was sort of started up as kind of a quasi charitable destination for people down on their luck. And yeah, the different colonies definitely had sort of different foundational ideas. I think just because Pennsylvania was open to more of them and had a less definite mission when it started, other than we got to get some of this money back, it was open to a lot more conflict and just a lot more possibilities.
And just kind of looking back at just the Iroquois are such a unique thing in Native American history that can be sourced because they were well established before the Europeans even set. They had to be dealt with to where as you get kind of like more southern, yes, they still had to deal with Native peoples and tribes, but they weren't as, and when I say this very loosely, they weren't as connected as the Iroquois were. It was easier to deal with individual tribes where you had to deal with the Iroquois or else nothing else was going to get done.
Right. So with that being, go ahead.
Okay. I was just going to say, from the French perspective, Pennsylvania ended up at this point where it was kind of the meeting point between the French influence and the British influence. And so they didn't have quite as much interaction with some of the others. You do see some in New England, in that area, but ultimately we see as it goes through the revolutionary period and into the early republic, you see that really all the regions of the country start to experience some of this foreign influence in affairs in North America. It really just increases from here, but it does seem like this is an early flashpoint for that French influence in the British colonies.
So do you think with that level of diversity of place of origin, of religion, of all of these factors, does that give Pennsylvania a more contentious legacy?
I think it sneaks up on you. Like I think it kind of is like the perfect merging of all, like Jerry was just saying, like it's all three worlds kind of blending together in a way that you don't necessarily get anywhere else, because Ohio, while it was more under French control, the French didn't really set up that many settlements. The French were, it seemed to, at least from my perspective, were just happy to make money off of trading with Native Americans in the fur trade, to where the English, they were staying. They had completely different plans. And same thing with German. And it's just kind of, well, it wasn't contentious because it's from a native perspective. It doesn't seem like it was a violent area until the English until the English and the French and all of them start working, and where it ends up being like the spark of the French and Indian War.
Right. Robert asks, what did British colonists expect they would get in the North American lands economically, given the big money was being made in the Caribbean colonies?
Well, the Caribbean was kind of full, for lack of a better term, by the time that Pennsylvania came around. Like, Caribbean colonists were going to Carolina because there's limited land on the Caribbean islands. And then added to that, it takes a lot of you had to have a much bigger initial investment to get started with sugar and to actually make it profitable. And I mean, a lot of colonists who were already in the area when they turned to sugar were not able to do that.
Yeah,
and the ones that did thanks largely to Dutch help.
Yeah, by the end of the 17th century, just like Sarah was saying, like all of the sugar concerns had sort of consolidated into like just a handful of really big plantations. So everybody's like, it was still a place where I could have a chance. Right.
Well, that seems reasonable then. You're looking for an opportunity to find something that's not so oversaturated and monopolized at a point that, colonization is happening.
And also,
no, go ahead.
Well, and also, like, the Caribbean, even the people who owned plantations at the Caribbean at this point in time, a lot of them didn't live there. So if you were looking for a place where you could actually move to, the land was in North America. The Caribbean magnates had largely gone back to England and just left slaves running it. And so you're not, like, even if you can start a sugar plantation, that's not what you're going to be, like, you're not going to be living there. That's not going to be your lived experience.
Well, and it also speaks to, from the British perspective, that the fur trade was kind of a contingency plan, because they were seeing that the French were having success in that. And even though, there were times whenever the big European wars would happen, the trade would dry up, and they, read accounts of, all these furs just sitting there going to waste, and them having to destroy them because they couldn't sell them until peace came again. But during peacetime, it was a lucrative trade, and the French pretty much had it locked up, and you wouldn't see people of, from what came the United States really getting big in the fur trade. It would be still a few decades down the line, but they were starting to try and break into this, and that becomes part of the conflict. It becomes, trying to make this enterprise because they see that it is for these other people.
Right. So Monica has asked the great crossover question here. Did the popes have any say about the happenings? I'll let you guys start this off because this is a bit modern for my papal research. Anything to do with the Catholics that the Pope had to say?
I do know that, the world had gotten divided up in the 16th century.
Treaty
Portugal
of
can have this part and Spain can have that part.
Yes.
And the Pope was kinda anti-slavery in the New World because he'd really rather you kept them there and turned them into Catholics.
But if they weren't going to be Catholics, then slavery was just fine. We do know that that was something that was said for sure. Was there anything being done, given the fact that we're dealing with not a conflict, but a convergence of Catholics, Protestants, Quakers? Is there anything that we see the Catholics trying to take any sort of edge through theological justification?
I do know that, like, you had to make Maryland the Catholic colony and you had to make everywhere else the not Catholic colony, because basically by the end of the English Civil Wars, it was seriously like, ew, Catholics. Like, when they started Georgia, they literally said, any religion is welcome here. All of them, every single one except for the Jews and the Catholics.
Always that caveat, but that seems to be a long-standing. There is quite a history through colonial America through to even the early 20th century of a bias against Catholics in particular because of the foundation of Protestant weirdos, for sure. So we have 3 minutes. I'm going to ask Robert's last question. Aside from growing rice in the tidelands of the Carolinas and the failure to find gold in Virginia, what would they produce in the Chesapeake? Chesapeake. I'm not American. I apologize. To make the trip valuable.
A lot of root vegetables. At least I know when the Pilgrims and then European settlers would come in, they would have to learn native, just what they were growing. Potatoes kind of took everywhere. I'm blanking on some of the other root vegetables, but essentially that's what they would produce. But really the name of the game, at least for the Iroquois and for native peoples, it was all about fur. I mean, the beaver.
Tobacco. It was tobacco. Tobacco was the Chesapeake cash crop. In fact, they were growing so much tobacco and plowing the land so hard and washing the topsoil so much. A lot of what's dredged in the Chesapeake today is the topsoil that washed off the shoreline into the Chesapeake Bay. There is old paintings of sailboats basically tied up to a tree.
Wow.
Like, it's also, sorry.
Yeah. So tobacco.
Perfect.
But it is worth noting that tobacco was not actually particularly valuable, and Virginia stayed in an economic slump easily through the end of the 17th century. It was the first colony to be founded by the British. It was basically the last one to find any sort of economic stability because tobacco was just, it was not enough. And so they tried silk, they tried some other things like that. They tried iron, they tried timber, they tried pitch and tar, and it was just tobacco was what they had, but it was not a particularly good option.
As many presidents from Virginia could attest.
Yeah, it was, tobacco was profitable like NFTs for like that long, and then everybody else got into it, and then the price cratered, and then it was just subsistence.
And that is a perfect place to end because we are at time. So thank you so much, panelists. I really enjoyed listening to that. And for all of you who are here in the audience, we'll see you at the next one. Bye.
Thanks, everyone.
Thank you.